Hey everybody.
Hey.
It's been a while since we've been back together in this room, in this space. The last time I was here, this was not completed. And today it is. That's massive. I want to start by welcoming everyone to Frugal Bookstore. If you don't know about Frugal, it is the oldest Black-owned bookstore in the city of Boston. It's been around for longer than I've been alive. And I used to run through Frugal in the stacks at its previous location. Nubian Ocean was here on this corner. I used to ride the #1 bus from Central Square in Cambridge right here to the station, and then walk to Nativity Prep. That was across the street from Ruggles. It's funny, I mentioned that in some of my music, and Madi's that's your music is like a map to the city. You can map your life and your experiences by the train stations that you mentioned. And so, Frugal's a legacy business for the city of Boston, and it's a really special place. And especially today, right, in the political environment that we're in, that's trying to erase our history, our cultural bearers, and where that knowledge lies, right? There's this anti-intellectual movement that's happening. And so spaces like this, we got to protect and we got to, support. And you do that by literally just buying books. But even if you're not the biggest reader, there's other stuff here, y'all, like fantastic artwork that is for sale. There are calendars, there are gifts, there's lotions and incense and all sorts of interesting stuff. And so if you have any questions, we have Clarissa who's here. She's one of the owners, Clarissa and Leonard, who I think is here somewhere. Yeah, he might have stepped out. And we also have Kiara, who is here to support the event. I met Kiara as a DJ, and so y'all might recognize her as DJ Troy Frost. Yeah. And just fantastic, an amazing ear, and incredible support. We got David, who is taking photography here at the event. Shout out to him. If you've ever been to the Bridgeside Ciphers, you might recognize David from some of those fantastic photos. And sitting with me up here is Des Polk. Hey. Some of y'all might know her as Radical Black Girl. I met Des through an event that she hosted 8 years ago. It's called Resistance. That's insane. When you mentioned that the other day at GBH, I was like, has it really been
8 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I had already flown out to California, right? My Caliversary is December 1st, 2011. And, I just missed home a ton. And anytime I had a chance to come back to the city, I wanted to find all of these amazing artists and wherever they were doing, slam poetry, hip hop, open mics. I just wanted to be in those spaces. And so I met some folks through the Feel It, Speak It open mic series, and that used to happen in Jamaica Plain at Bella Luna, and that was really awesome to see. But when I saw this event for artists who were also activists, community organizers, educators, there were workshops. It was this whole immersive 6-hour experience. I was like, I want to be a part of that. I will fly back to Boston. You don't even have to pay me to perform. I will just show up. I promise I'll be there.
You're still going to get paid.
Yeah. No, and you were true to your word for that, and I appreciated that. But I was willing to do whatever it took just to be in the room, because from 3,000 miles away, I recognized how special that effort was. And then I walk in the room, and it's 300 people in the Oberon, right? And it's this small kind of community theater, and it's packed, and I meet folks like Oompa, right? I, run into Amanda Shea again, because she's everywhere. I meet Anson, I meet Megazoid, I meet, trendsetters, and just all of these amazing creatives. And we have the time of our lives. I get on stage, I perform as Black Jesus.
Yeah. Nobody will ever forget Like, who's the dude in the robe? It was crazy.
Yeah. I had a fresh bald head at that time and prayer beads, and I went in for like 12, 15 minutes, whatever the set was. But it was incredible from that point. And I remember kind of talking to you even after, just about how amazing that experience was and how rare it is to bring so many people together, particularly around, this like conscious, creative culture that, we've owned and created as Black people from the beginning. And so to do that in that space and to see it celebrated in the middle of Harvard Square, where y'all, like, it's Harvard Square. For those who are from here and then you know, but if not, like, Harvard feels like the opposite of where we are right now at times. And I've seen some cool stuff happen at Harvard over the past couple of years.
But there was definitely a bridge that needed to be built.
Absolutely. And so to create space for us in a place that, didn't always accept us was special. And I remember telling you that and telling you to keep going and wanting to just follow whatever it was that you were doing, because I was like, this is the coolest thing. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're at, wherever you're at, that's where I want to be. Those are the folks I want to tap into, because you got it. You understood. And I've always appreciated that about you. And so when I saw that you were then publishing books, and I had started this process of, the curriculum is the thing that came first. I had all these questions, right? And being part of City Year for a number of years and youth programs and juvenile halls, all this kind of stuff. I understood kind of what it took to put together programs and to ask these kind of guiding, central questions to lead conversation. And part of the impetus for starting this was, I've seen leadership development in the corporate space, in the nonprofit space. I've seen these folks in suit and ties, in the corner office, and politicians who will come to communities for the photo op. And for me, that was never really what leadership looked like. And so I wanted to explore what it meant to be a leader, specifically what it meant to be a leader within hip hop culture. And that starts with self, right? Because you can't ask questions about others or the outside world without first examining who you are and where you stand in your understanding of this concept of leadership. And then you turn the lens to your local community. Can you identify in your community people, places, organizations where leadership exists? And then if you can do that locally, then how come it's not happening at the pop culture, mainstream, larger, level that is hip hop culture at a global level? Why don't we see it there? And, I think a lot of the answers, if you're really kind of just tuned into the work, it's kind of implied and understood. But I realized that I had great teachers. I had great mentors. I had great people around me who were constantly having these conversations. And in the work that I was doing, even as a DEI consultant, there are people who've never had a social justice conversation in their life. They don't know the words to have the conversations. They can't define them. So you can't come to a common understanding of, what the problems even are, much less how to get to a solution. Right. And so, the book kind of started from that place. And when I started with the curriculum and engaging with young folks in community, my first session around it was right here at Frugal. Nice. And we opened it up for community. And then there was an opportunity to continue this work with Beat the Odds. And working with young folks, they opened up this process to stories, examples, and I started writing, right? I always kind of write raps and poems, but then it became other things like essays and journal entries and just, I ended up in journalism a couple of years ago, summer of 2020. We had to change the way the Sacramento news media covered Black and brown communities. And we started that work before George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery by diversifying the amount of writers of color that they had available to them, and we were able to pay those people double. You know, we found grant money from Facebook to pay new writers to incentivize their journalism with this paper that had a 160-year history of like excluding Black and brown folks. And so we started to change the face of media out there, and that's kind of where my journalism bug started. I didn't go to school for that. You know, just ended up in a room with a bunch of newspaper editors and journalists and folks who didn't understand, again, the terms and the scope of the work. And so I had to define that for them using my background in like education, activism, organizing, etc. But there's something I think also fundamentally different when you are an artist and a creative and you approach work like that. Like when you're an artist and you're a creative and you walk into a classroom, when you're an artist and creative and you walk into a community space, when you think about public policy, you can like shift and transform the way that people think about designing those types of outcomes, because you're constantly redesigning it for your own world and your own work. And it's such an interesting thing when folks don't have imagination, when they feel limited by the status quo and the system that exists. And so starting with the book, starting with questions, starting with imagination, and by the time I was ready and I felt like I had enough material, I was like, I want to do this the right way. I've never worked with a publisher. I even like released a book previously, like self-published through blurb.com. It's just not the same. It's not the same. Also, it wasn't like a chapter book. It was like a lookbook of like lyrics and images and all this really cool stuff. And it was at the start of the pandemic to get people to engage with my music differently, right? Through a more visual lens. And so this was like really my first book.
It's a lookbook.
Yeah, and I wanted to go to an expert and somebody who just understood the process and could walk me through it, and Des did that. And I just want to turn it over to you for a couple minutes to kind of share about you getting started as a publisher and the kind of books that you worked on and the kind of books that you want to work on in the future, because there are a lot of folks here today who I know are also interested in publishing their own work. And we're recording this conversation, so those folks who aren't in the room today can also get that information too. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, and then we'll kind of dive into more questions and stuff around the book.
Firstly, just thank you all for being here. Thank you to Frugal Bookstore for not only hosting this event, but for putting hip hop leadership on your shelf. That means a lot to this community that we're building, to the legacy that you talked about. So that can't go unsaid. And thank you for bringing it back, like setting the history of how we met and all the many connections that have developed across mediums in our city. And that's a part of hip hop leadership, is like we have to go back and lay the foundation to how these things come to be, right? So I published my first book, which was called Radical Black Girls Guide for Well-Being and Beyond. And I have some copies with me as well, but this event is not about me, about that.
Y'all buy that book. Lily, did you get that book?
I do have that.
My sister has that book, so y'all should get that book.
Party, right? Yeah, party a few years ago. So that's how it started, and I'll say a little bit about why it was important for me to write the book when I did. It was a really odd and traumatic time in this country. It was like when there were like back-to-back mass shootings a few years ago, and it was just really weird. It was like we couldn't catch our breath from one traumatic event to the other, and I'm like, man, people need a space where they can find their peace within themselves and like nurture their mental health. What space exists like that? And I know that for myself, journaling has always been a coping mechanism for me, creative journaling. So I said, like you as an educator and an artist who's constantly coming up with curriculum and activities, I had already had like these different journaling exercises and prompts and activities that I used to do as like one-off things when I would go do workshops. And so I just started compiling them, like, so there's worksheets about the power of affirmation, of knowing your history, visualizing your future self. There's one called Fears, Limits, and Lies. And it's all about, for every fear that you've been taught or imposed on you, then there's a belief that needs to counteract that. For every lie that you've been told about yourself, that there's a truth that you need to supplement that with, And so it's all about like changing your mindset and just, and then there's a rage page, because there's things that we are rightful to have rage about, and it's good to get it out. And the next page is like, if you need more space, keep going. But at some point, it's time to get to the solutions, So that's how I got into publishing. And out of, we as creatives, we got to come up with merch, we got to have all different types of stuff. And over time, I realized as many things as I came up with, t-shirts, this and that, my books were always selling out. My book became my best-selling product out of everything. And so I knew as long as I have some books, I'll be okay. And with that, I was like, no, this is something special. And I want to teach other people how to do this. But I need to do it. And so on a flight back to Boston, I was working with an organization called the Repair America Collective, which is an organization all around reparatory justice, reparations. And so they came to me and commissioned me to create an educational zine on the 5 steps of reparations. And so it was a project, to say the least, right? It's heavy thinking, and to break it down in a way where even a young person can understand these really heavy concepts. And so I was on a plane with a suitcase full of hundreds of books that I designed, published, and printed. And it just hit me. And God was just like, Destiny, you're a publisher. You need to move like it. And I was like, okay, how do I do that? Like, I did the process of it, but how do I legitimize it? How do I learn the business of it? How do I communicate with printers, learn industry standards, make it legitimate? And so then that became my journey of doing that research and putting myself in the right places. And so I ended up working with the print house that prints my books and just printed these books. And so I'm learning all of this different terminology, learning how the books are made, how they're bound, the process of formatting, cutting, all these different things that we don't see when it comes to how manufacturing happens. And I was privileged enough to be able to be behind the scenes and understand that while still working on my business at the same time. And at an appointed time, it was time to step out and really put it into action. And I just want to say this for anyone who has something that they're working on, and you feel like you're not ready because you have to have XYZ ready. You have to speak it first. Be your first witness. Hear it out of your own mouth and allow others to hear it too, because you never know. There's someone in this room that once you speak that thing, someone's like, I need that thing. And that's how my publishing company jumped off. I literally just made a post on Instagram, and I was probably on my way or after coming from the print house, and I'm like, hey y'all, by the way, I'm your plug for all things print publishing. 300 people saw that. If I didn't open my mouth and speak it, then people didn't know that they could come to me for that. And you came to me for that, and you were like, Des,
yo, I got a book.
And I was like, let's go. And it was, and in some ways it was just that easy in terms of the establishment. And then of course we got into the real work of it, right? But in terms of, thank you so much. In terms of just putting yourself in position to be a go-to person for your community in whatever field that you find yourself in, as long as you're adding value and bridging the gap, and so that people don't make the same pitfalls and mistakes that you did when you were learning, then you're always going to be in business. And so I just want to thank you for trusting me, you know, in this process, and from one leader to another, just being an example. You know, this is an example of collaboration, of trust, and of just being the example, because sometimes people just need to see that it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's been my entire life.
Yeah.
That's been my entire life. And my sister knows, because we have 2 older sisters who are about 10 years older than us. And, you know, we saw them go to college, but we didn't see college. You know what I mean? We saw them move into the professional kind of field and workspace, but we had no idea what that was really like. There's not like take your sibling to work day. Maybe there should be. You know what I mean? We can finesse that for sure. But you know, when I think about how many people help to demystify the process for everything, from like school applications to filling out stuff for scholarships to building your resume, developing interview skills. When I joined City Year here in Boston, they demystified leadership.
I'm a City Year kid too.
See? This is probably why, I don't know, there's something in the sauce. But they gave it language in words. I posted about it. I posted 24 times in the past 24 hours. I apologize.
Don't apologize. I was like, oh yeah, he's ready. He must have it on the calendar.
I just had this
we weren't
idea.
up for 24 hours. Y'all, he should have scheduled it. Okay.
I tried. Instagram limits the amount of posts that you can schedule in a day.
Wow.
So I tried. But it's all good. I got enough sleep. But I shared my Idealist Handbook from City Year, which is a book where they essentially codified their culture. Why they chose the colors they chose, what specific symbols mean in their logo, what are their values as an organization. They even have a section that's full of like little pieces of wisdom, almost quotes, right? Even if the quotes aren't attributed to a specific person, these are just sayings that helped people kind of get through their service year. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. I've never seen anything like this. At schools, they might have like a value statement, but they don't really live that, right? At City Year, there was this level of accountability where, like, if your socks weren't black or white, they were having a conversation with you. However you feel about that, right? That wasn't fun as a manager to have to manage somebody with purple socks, but like, it's just what it was. It was part of like the water that they swam in, the air that they breathe. When I think about what is that then for hip hop, it left the door really wide open. I had done a little bit of digging previously, and I found out about the Hip Hop Declaration of Peace, which I thought was really interesting. I think it was May or June of 2001. If y'all could imagine, about 300 hip hop delegates travel to the UN, right? And they have this essentially like a symposium, a summit, I guess, where they attempt to define at a global level, in order to get hip hop recognized as a global culture, right? They attempted to define what hip hop culture was. And they came up with these 18 principles. And so I've shared these principles. Joy started sharing these principles. Joy Beats is in the back of the room. What's up, Joy? And so if you're interested in kind of learning about what those are, then like feel free to dive in and take a look. But if you weren't an adult or a fan of those artists, then you missed this whole lesson, right? You don't even know that this thing exists. We'll prove it. How many people knew that there was a hip hop Declaration of Peace before walking in this room today? There's like a handful, right? And it's probably because we talked about it, right? That's my point. If you didn't have access to Jay-Z or Nas or name your favorite hip hop artist, right? Then how do you have access to the wisdom of their journey? A lot of people just like, well, I just listen to the music. Jay-Z told me that he gave us the blueprints in the music. But I'm not a drug dealer. So like, I'm not like accepting dirty money. I'm not running in the streets. Like, sure, there are entrepreneurial principles I can learn from you, but it's really hard to talk about investing or buying a business when you're just like trying to scrape a couple of dollars to get on the train or the bus, right? And, you know, it's, I think, admirable for folks to share their narratives, their stories. There are things that we can learn, but not everything is applicable when you look at artists in the mainstream.
Right.
What I learned just by being in community, by being in schools, a lot of folks look at teachers as the only expert in the room, as opposed to flipping the dynamic and focusing on a student-centered approach where now you're, 20 to 30 students in a classroom are the experts
of their own experience.
Right. And they get to bring that to enrich and enhance what that learning experience could be. How different would school be if that was the case? The way that folks would talk about parents of students, it's the same thing. You don't care, you didn't pick up your kid, or you showed up in pajamas today, or whatever, right? Total judgment on very little facts. How would the dynamic flip if you said to parents, if we gave you control over the school budget, what would you prioritize? And we did that at Leah Floyd Elementary School in Sacramento. I was the family coordinator. And so I ran a parent leadership class. And this is what we did. Moms, dads, uncles, aunts, they would come in the morning. We would give them breakfast a couple times a week. And I would say, hey, looking for your feedback. And if you're interested, we've got a class with a facilitator coming in. If you want to learn some of these skills or how the school district works or how to navigate this kind of system, you tell me and I'll find the resources in community. I'll bring them in and you can get what you need. We'll kind of meet you in the middle, right? Just flipping the way that we thought about that dynamic. When you do that with community engagement, you can literally turn somebody who is a friend of mine, his name is Chinua Rhodes, and I write about him in the book. We met in a hip hop cipher. During an educational training, our homie DJ Mike B, he ran this hip hop nonprofit. It was an after school program. And so, he brought his turntables in and we were like, this is cool. We rock with DJ Mike B. And then he said, I want y'all to write raps. And we were like, we don't, we're ready. Just hand the mics over now. I grab the mic, I do my rap, Chinua grabs his mic, he does his rap. We realize that we're bald black guys with beards who love education and community building and all this kind of stuff. And I watch him go from like gold teeth, 5X white tee and jabots, right, to school board trustee president for the district that his kids go to school in. That's just one of his jobs. The other job is he got picked up by the mayor to be the mayor's director of community engagement because of the way he was showing up for young folks and community and artists and just advocating for folks. And so I had a front row seat to the campaign, to building businesses with him, to seeing this in action. And I'm just like, how come my friend has not been on any of these 30 under 30, 40 under 40 lists, these top 25 whatevers, right? Like, how come his brand of leadership is not getting recognized at the level that I think it should be. And so, I'd talk to a couple journalists and I'd try to see if there's a journalist in the city who could cover this positive, black dude doing a whole bunch of stuff, just like, just tell his story. I had a journalist in Sacramento tell me, well, positive black news doesn't sell newspapers. I went off. Long tirade, lots of curse words. It's a whole thing. But it really set me off. And I write about it just a little bit in like chapter 6. Mm-hmm. And just that story of how hip hop can personally transform your life, right? And I saw it through my own experience, but then I saw it through my friend's experience. And I saw how he was able to then physically change how his community looked, right? You're talking about a guy who was able to start a real estate, development company. He walked into a bank with a 6-figure check as his first investment, and the banker just like stopped business and was just like, I don't believe that this check is even real. Where'd you get this money, right? I saw him develop homes, take out old fences, right, and replace them with brand new ones, repaint crosswalks to make them more beautiful, put murals on basketball courts and on the sides of school buildings. And, when he wanted to find ways to fund this work, we were able to work together to find sponsors in the community. And so there's a company in Sacramento called SMUD. And, I had some relationships there, made some introductions, and we were able to get him $35,000 over the first couple of years of some of that community work to then pay for a bunch of that stuff to happen. That relationship is still going on. That investment has now increased, if not 2 to 3 times as much. But they're on to like bigger and better things now, right? They're building like tech centers for high schools. They're building community gardens. They're doing so much to transform the south side of Sacramento, which is very much like Dorchester, right? Imagine the city councilor or the school board trustee transforming the way that the neighborhood looks, feels, and is relevant, right, for the community that lives there, right? Not the community that they anticipate coming in, right? We're not redeveloping for some folks who are not here yet, right? But building for the people to make their lives better, as they are and where they live in their community. And
Can
so,
I say something about the book and just about you in general?
mm-hmm.
You give so many people their flowers in this book.
I try.
You didn't try. You succeeded in doing that. As you're telling the stories, I'm just thinking about all the organizations that you mentioned, not just in Sacramento, but in Boston. Mm-hmm. The artists that you've worked with and that you've had these relationships with over years of work, right? And that's what's so special about how you went about developing this project. From the album to the book itself, that you reached out to other people, so that this is it's a communal success, that you have artists like Grateful Queen, that you have artists like Red Shades come on. I didn't even know that until I saw the video. Yeah. But yeah, so just the fact that you find these really authentic ways in your storytelling to make sure that other people are seen. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I think it's important because I think sometimes we get caught up with looking at the whole forest instead of individual trees to check on the health of the forest, right? And so celebrities, you know what I mean, is like where everybody points to, and they say, well, you had a black president, so black people must be doing well. It's not, just because it worked out for one person,
right?
And I'd argue, I don't even know if it really worked out for him, right?
That's the people that believe in the trickle-down effect.
Right. And, when you realize that there are people who live in your community right now who have a greater impact on your life than the people outside of it. It makes you value the people in your community more, right? And every relationship is not transactional, right? You don't need something from someone to see the value in them, right? Sometimes it's just, I'm supporting you because you do amazing work, and we need more of that. Even if that work doesn't directly benefit me, it doesn't have to, right? Because it's benefiting other members of my community, right? We talk about organizations like Heal the Hood, Beat the Odds, right? And a number of other community organizations who are local here. And then you have these examples of people at a local level who then shift things even at a national level, right? I have a friend, their name is Jasper James, who was a DJ, musician, artist, right? A queer artist, in the 80s and trying to kind of figure out life. Took all those skills, developed a marketing company, and them and their partners started doing media campaigns and supporting different organizations. Jasper created a Black Bill of Rights, a set of policy recommendations for the ACLU to disrupt what was happening with the police officer Bill of Rights in the state of California. And what they realized was that if they could create policy to help shape what was happening in the state of California, that could also impact people around the country. But where they started in their journey, right, was like any number of the artists who are here in the room, right? Playing shows, gig to gig, just trying to figure out life, and then you look 20 years down the line and you're like, wow, you've been able to do something that was extremely impactful. And that's not because there was an accreditation or a degree that kind of stamped that for them, right? That imagination and ability to really remix the world was already there, right? And so that's the thing I really hope kind of folks take away and really dive into, is understanding that these stories aren't the end, right? They're the start of a conversation, right? It's how do you now ask the question, what is it in my life, right, that I get to remix and transform? How do I recognize that ability in other people? And what are some of the larger things that we want to tackle, right? And how do we get creative about some of those larger kind of social, community or policy type issues? And so at this point, I would love to be able to kind of open it up for kind of questions or comments or thoughts. I know that folks haven't had a chance to read the book, but based on this conversation, I'm curious about what questions might exist in a room, either about anything we talked about or about the book and the process and how this came to be. I really want to open it up. I see you, Nadi. What's up?
You had mentioned earlier that you were mad at the guy from Sacramento saying that positive Black news isn't selling. So how do you change that narrative? What do you think? Because in some sense, I kind of agree. I feel like when they post, especially me, I'm from Brockton, so you post something from Brockton, negative happens, like that's the first thing. If I say I'm from Brockton, somebody's looking at me funny. So what's your suggestion to make sure that the positive news gets pushed before the negative news, or even the positive music?
What I found were that a lot of the journalists who are in the media are some of the folks who've never had a social justice conversation in their life. And so they went to school for journalism, and they have a method for thinking about the way that they write articles, but they're not asking these questions, these three kind of questions. One was, what's my framing for this article, right? Like, how did I hear about it? Who did I hear about it from, right? And how does that shape the way I now ask questions about what's happening in this situation? So for instance, if I told you there were fights in the Reggie Lewis Center, right? And I left out that the Reggie Lewis Center was in Roxbury and that it was, Black kids in Roxbury or whatever, that might frame your view of the situation. Now, if the facts were that it was some shoving, right, but no fists were thrown, right, that also changes your perspective, right? So the framing, the facts, the like all of that that's being presented. Question everything, right? And understand that people are coming into those stories. Half the time, the story is written before they write it, and so it's hard to trust it if the journalist doesn't have a strong opinion or say in a matter. Because sometimes journalists are like, I want to say that, but my editor's going to tell me, you got to make it more sensational. You got to make it so that it's more, oppositional in nature. And so sometimes it's the framing that's there. The other questions are, who's being interviewed as a source for the story, right? Because that's also very telling about how the rest of the story is going to go, right? If you're interviewing folks about small businesses, but then you go to a local community activist who is your only source on Black or brown news, then you may not get a true perspective about what is happening with small businesses. Not that the activist doesn't know or isn't informed, but that's a different world than what's happening with entrepreneurs, right? The last question is this, it's who's left out? A lot of journalists will write their 750 words if it's a front page story, or 350 words if it's like a shorter, article and piece. And they'll just stop when they're done. But nobody will ever go back and say, what perspective is missing from this that would make this better? And so when I sat with literally every section of the newspaper, and mind you, less than 15% of their stories covered Black and brown folks, and the majority, the 15%, were in the sports section. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, that was really how it was. And so, when I show up to day one and I'm sitting in these conversations and I ask them those 3 questions, it silences so much of the room. Only the veteran reporters are like, yo, we can't write like that. Like, I hear you, but we also know where those stories get buried if you write like that. And so there were folks who were too afraid to challenge the status quo. There are some folks who don't know that they can, who want to, but don't know that they can. And so I encourage artists to also just become the media.
I was about to say that.
Because that's who we are right now.
Yeah, can
right?
I
Yeah,
add to
please.
that? Hey, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
I've said before that I am the media, and at one point, Radical Black Girls website was very much that, on reaching international people from all across the world, and not just from these publications, outlets that we sometimes fight so hard to be seen for them to tell our stories. But it's also, my thing is, as many times as I've had different media coverage across newspapers or platforms, it's always because of the impact. Like focusing on, don't just focus on how you're perceived individually, but also how is the impact that you're making in your community felt in a way that people must tell that story, This is not about proving yourself. Like, you know who you are. You know the value of your history and your culture. Other people may not. But if you focus on the true impact that's being made and the experiences and the memories that are being created, and then capturing those things and inviting people who want to be there to capture those things, then naturally you are capturing your archive, right? And inviting other people to give their input and to tell that story. So to your point of you being from Brockton and you feel like, okay, I'm only seeing the negative things go viral, or people have this stigma around what it means to be where I'm from. It was the same thing coming from Dorchester. It's the same thing with me living out in Houston, and when people hear I'm from Boston, the first thing that they ask is, there are Black people in Boston? And then I have to go through a whole history lesson of like, back to Phyllis Wheatley,
Crispus Attucks.
Okay, and like, come on. And so in one sense, like,
it's never not our responsibility to tell our stories. Meaning, it's always going to be your responsibility to tell your story and keep living out the positive change, right? Like, and from the perspective of Radical Black Girl, it's like, especially within music and media, entertainment, you know, showing that it's cool to care. Like, no, it's cool to care about your community. It's cool to care about making sustainable change. It's profitable to do things on purpose. And you just have to do it and continue to do it and find your people that believe in the same thing. And like this book, that is a communal effort of the project, the album, like Resistance, where we met 8 years ago, and we just had a successful one at Hibernian just a few days ago. The more people that you get involved around a common vision, the more buy-in that you get from a community, and not in a way that is taking advantage of people's energy, but in a way that's reciprocal, then that's going to be felt. It's going to be seen and it's going to be felt. But always make sure you capture it for yourself. And if nobody else writes the story, that you write it.
You'll publish it.
And I'll publish it, exactly.
Right.
Sorry, I just want to ask you, it was free. Love your message too. I was writing. I hope y'all didn't think I wasn't paying attention.
No,
You said the first one was framing. The second one, I missed.
So the first one is check the frame. So framing. The second one is who are your sources?
Yep, and then who's left out.
Yeah, and then who's left out.
Great. Thank you guys.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Again, without having read the book yet, but a lot of pillars, values, strategies in it. What bubbles up to the top for you?
I think there's a few, I think, general concepts that seem to kind of weave throughout. The first one is community building. So that's chapter 10, also the last song on the album. Nothing really happens in silos, right? This idea of like American like individualism, the like rugged West, right? And venturing out and like owning all this land and just being by yourself, that's like not real, right? It took so many people to build villages, cities, just everything that we know. Like, we don't survive. We can't be human without other people. And so I think being weary of like people who are like anti that, because it's like almost anti-human. But that thread of being in community, I think is something that in every chapter you find that people found different ways to do that. I think the other thing is around empowerment and resilience, where, you know, some challenges might be small, right? It might feel like they're small. Maybe it's like a self-esteem thing where you're like, man, this is not important to anybody else. This is just me. But for you, it's a massive undertaking to build that confidence and to find yourself and your identity. And so, you know, I think putting people's challenges into perspectives and understanding that not everybody's 100% is going to look the same, because everybody's battles that they're fighting is also different. So what empowerment, what resilience looks like for one person, even if we grew up in the same household, right, can be different than other people in that same household. Those are a couple ones that really stand out.
I'm looking to see which ones I want to pop out there too.
Yeah.
Authenticity and self-expression. In the book, Paul talks about like his earliest writings and just finding his voice as a rapper in middle school.
and what was cool at the time, you know, versus what was true and what was real, you know. And as an artist, no matter what your medium is, it's a journey of discovery to find your authentic voice and to know that your story and your self-expression is valuable, not just being a parrot of the things that you think are cool, but that you think are profitable, right? So I thought that was like foundational. And then I want to bring up social commentary and advocacy, because that's what my platform is built off of. But the examples that you pull from your network of people and how they've been able to leverage their lived experience, right, to influence that change and advocate for people on different levels. That was super important to me. And then I want to bring up ownership and entrepreneurship, which, what was that, chapter 9?
Yep.
Look at me knowing your book. Come on now. I read this book in and out. But yeah, ownership and entrepreneurship. I love that you put that within hip hop leadership, because even though, you know, our stories are different, but we start out as independent artists, we start out as educators, and somewhere along the line we have to learn the business of being a creative to make it work, right? And so, and it's a process that we didn't, like you said, you didn't go to school for these things. I didn't go to school to learn how to build a platform. Life built me, and that built the platform, you know, and then with that I became an entrepreneur out of necessity, because there was no other option. But it's so inspiring that the examples that you use of how owning your space in creativity in hip hop can then become the platform for you to build businesses, not just one, and how that frames you and trains you in real life. Like, and as easy as the business of this book, it costs this much to make it, it costs this much to do, this is the value of it, this is how it's going to be sold, this is how it's going to be multiplied. Same thing from a t-shirt. Same, like, and these basic principles of how do we generate business and exchange of value, and the way that you break it down in this book from Nas starting off in one way and how he's taken it in his career as a businessman. So all the examples that you talk about, and so all of that to say, if you want to learn something about entrepreneurship through a hip hop lens, you should read chapter 9.
So you've spoken on a lot of key factors in regards to impact. The thing that comes to mind for me in asking you both, but how did you during this project ask yourself and maintaining your authenticity?
That's a great question. You know what's really interesting about authenticity and self-expression is that for almost like 85% of the young folks who experience the curriculum in this particular question, that was their value of choice. You know, I challenged all my young folks to create intentionally around one of the leadership values, especially after we had discussed and had all these different examples, but it was that one that really kind of stuck out to them. And when you hear young folks in the throes of trying to find themselves, and they're like, I'm not sure if I want to write this, not because I don't want to say it, because I don't know if I want this to be true for me yet. You know, there are just these really powerful moments in them expressing. And so, leading by example, right, and me being an artist, I have to demonstrate that it is okay to be, doubtful, to be vulnerable, to express the things that are uncertain to you at the time, maybe things you can't yet see. And so I think just working with them helped me understand that as much as I can be in the future and global society and all these issues, being present and understanding yourself, your feelings, and what's true for you, so you can express that. And like kids know, they have like a sixth sense. You know, they know when you're lying, but they can really, really resonate with you when you're telling the truth. And so I think, you know, they kept me honest in the process and authentic throughout, because I couldn't ask them to do something that I wasn't willing to do myself. And so that kind of challenge as an educator is something that I think helped me stay true to that particular value.
Did you want me to make this? Okay. How did I stay true to me and authentic within this process? I think in the editing process, so I'll say most authors or writers don't feel like they need an editor at first. They're like, no, we had this conversation. You're like, I think I'm good. I was like, I'm going to read it anyway. And one of the things that I tell people and that you learn sometimes in writing is this idea of kill your darlings, which sounds harsh, but it's about not taking things personally when it comes to critique. And so I always said that, like, hey, I'm going to give you some feedback, but don't take anything personally. I know this is your work, right? There's a sensitivity around it. But when it came to just going through and like looking through things about, okay, this feels clear, this could be said differently. Have you thought about that? Like there was a part where was it innovation chapter where we're talking about was it remixing, sampling?
Yeah, you told me to include a whole other section, and I was like, wait a minute, that's such a great idea. I completely missed that. But now I have to rework this within the word limit that I had set and do kind of take a new approach to how this thing was going to turn out.
But you were open to that.
Yeah, it was spot on also. It was like, how do I write a book like this and not talk about sampling or remixing? Like, that's crazy, right?
Yeah. So yeah, because we were talking about the connection between the past and the present and this idea of people music being a communication between the past and the present. And I was like, yeah, well, what about this part of it? You know, but and that's my authenticity coming through. It would be different if he maybe had an editor that didn't have any appreciation for the history of music and hip hop and culture, right? They may not have caught that. But for me, it was like, well, that's a part of my lived experience too. You know, so I think that part was just keeping it authentic and yeah, I mean, and I think just like on the business level, the personal communication level, the authenticity of just being open, you know, about capacity, staying and staying on it, like keeping, we have a deadline to set, we have to stay on top of these things, but still seeing one another as humans, you know, and having that flexibility, but still at the end of the day, like reaching the end goal. So that from my perspective is just like that. And then anytime that there was a question, me being there to answer. And you know, he takes on a lot. He has a lot of really big ideas and a lot of goals. And the part of me being authentic and my role is, okay, well, let's define that. Let's reel that part in. Let's make these things more attainable. Let's redefine what success looks like for this project at this level, and then go from there. You know, so just like making things that much more tangible. He's like,
yeah, because I wanted to be a New York Times bestseller in the first week, and I was like, I don't even know how to do that.
And he's like, and I want to be in 200 schools, you know, and I'm like, and that's great.
We gotta do this.
let's start with one. Like let's start here. Let's make a list first. If we want to be in 200 schools, do we have a list of even 50? But where do we start? And starting with the lowest hanging fruit and making the most impact, and going from there. So we've had a lot of those conversations as well.
I think we have a question over here. This might be one of the last 2 questions that we got.
Cool, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I've not heard of the hip hop Declaration of Peace, but it shouldn't surprise anybody that I don't know, haven't heard about it. I haven't heard about a lot of things. But what year was that promulgated? And I wonder what was the impact?
2001, and I think it's interesting because I feel like the impact is an ongoing thing. One of the things I think is a direct kind of benefit out of that was that hip hop was recognized as an international and global culture, right? That even without a specific defined set of borders, right? That there is a hip hop community that exists in countries all over the world, right? I have friends who know kids who are breakdancing on their heads in India who've like never met like black people, but they're rapping, starting schools around hip hop and like all of this stuff that's really kind of fascinating in the exploration of this culture. There's even a, I don't know if it's going to exist anymore, but there was a program through the United States the State Department called Next Level USA, where they used to send kind of crews of hip hop artists from around the country to other countries as part of like a cultural ambassador exchange program. And so I have multiple friends who've gone to like Morocco, Colombia, China, like all these places all around the world, and they taught and developed hip hop programming in those places, right? And then, you see the impact of that where some of those artists who first touched the beat machine are now some of the biggest artists in their country because of the impact of just connecting with a hip hop teacher, right? And so I think it's an ongoing thing. The impact is hard to define because there's no archive. There's not like a one hip hop archive. Martha Diaz, who founded the Hip Hop Education Center in New York, she was a former producer for Yo MTV Raps. But when they started kind of showing hip hop at an international stage, MTV didn't want to invest in developing what that programming would look like. So she left and went into the classroom and started to find people who cared about archiving hip hop culture and using hip hop as text, right? So magazines, music, lyrics, just anything that they could find so that kids could study what that was and begin to understand some of the cultural significance, history, and things that went into creating it. She started to preserve some of those items and became hip hop's first archivist, right? And so I heard her speak a couple years ago. We were working in California with the State Department of Education, creating a teacher credentialing pathway for hip hop artists to become classroom teachers. And she kind of spoke about how, imagine if there was a database of all the hip hop after school programs that existed. How many programs would be on that list, right? If there was a database of people who use hip hop in their, classroom during the day, how many teachers would be in that database or in that social network, right? There's not a lot of places where that exists. There are entities that are trying, like the Hip Hop Congress. They're a national network of hip hop focused nonprofits. Their mission is to preserve hip hop culture, and that looks like doing events, sometimes running workshops, sometimes hosting educational conferences right, or competitions, right, for international folks to come and experience what hip hop culture is and looks like. And so, some examples of that, when I first went into a juvenile hall, it was through the Hip Hop Congress, right, in California. And they were doing entrepreneurship, lessons with students to kind of show them that just because you are incarcerated right now, that doesn't mean that there's not a future for you. If you want to become an artist and pave your own way, there are a lot of lessons here. And even if you don't have a musical talent, there's still a lot of lessons here that you can use to build a business, for whatever it is that, you are interested in. They did things like that. So there's so many ways that hip hop has, I think, already transformed the world. But when I think about the Hip Hop Declaration of Peace as like the method for that, I don't know if it's always the method, but there's something in the culture that we have yet to give language to that allows people the ability to then shape their conditions in the way that they're living.
Okay, now since it's a declaration, it seems to me that there's some principles.
Yeah, there are 18 principles.
And what are those principles?
We can get into that. You can Google it. Also, I think the Temple of Hip Hop has it on their website as well. But they are things like hip hop will like respect and preserve life, whether that's children, elders, plants, animals, right? There's a principle around peace, right? And like stepping into like new countries or other places and not just respecting, right, those places and kind of learning their customs, their norms. There's some other ones too that like define some like days of celebration, like May 3rd is Rap Music Day, November is Hip Hop History Month, right, and things like that. There's also like a Hip Hop Appreciation Week. I just don't remember exactly when that is. So they have 18 principles that help to define sets of behaviors, kind of attitudes, and even kind of things that we should consider celebrating as well. Yeah.
Thank
you. Mm-hmm.
Do we have time for one more brief question? Okay.
I just want to say congratulations.
Thank you.
I think it was almost a year ago that we were sitting in a car going for a ride, and you're like, I think I'm going to write a book. And here we are. You never cease to amaze me. But for those who aren't in hip hop leadership or education, what do you want just a regular reader to walk away or take away from your book?
That's a great question.
Yeah. You don't have to wait for somebody to give you permission to live the way you want to live or to change and transform your life in the ways that you want to transform it. You could be waiting forever, right? And you might not ever receive that from anywhere else. I think the thing that's beautiful about hip hop culture is that you discover that power and ability, within yourself to then remake everything else, right? And so some people might see that as like naive or foolish. I don't, right? I think that imagination, idealism, and developing that sense of agency is so important for individuals, but not everybody gets a chance to experience that because we're not all like, not everybody's a reflective, person. Not everybody journals, not everybody's kind of in tune with that sense of self. But I think when you take time to develop that and kind of quiet the noise of everything else around you, I think it can be a very powerful tool to transform your life, lives of others around you, and just the world at large.
That's beautiful. I'd like to add one more thing to that. From what I hope that people could take from the book as well. If you don't see yourself as a creative or an educator, an advocate,
and just a reader that you see that your position, wherever you find yourself in life, is just as valuable in making an impact in someone's life. Because there's so many people that were not creatives that you spoke to, that were the people that, you know, made some fundamental impact in your life, you know, and like you could be that person in whatever field you're in. And so I think just framing the book from hip hop leadership, but also just like finding the leadership quality within yourself, you know.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording because I have no idea how much time is
Yeah, my
left.
phone died.